For 27 years, the name Nancy Guthrie floated in the background of one of Hollywood's most famous careers. Mentioned once quietly, then never again. No interview confirmed it. No record explained it. The public assumed they knew who she was. They were wrong. What her name actually represents, and why it was hidden for years, reshapes the story everyone thought they already understood. And it starts with a single decision made long before anyone was watching. 3 years before the silence became permanent, her name surfaced exactly once. In a single archived interview, buried inside a paragraph that most people skimmed past without stopping. Nancy Guthrie. 2 words. No follow-up. No explanation. For anyone paying close attention, that absence was the most interesting thing about her. Because in the world she existed in, a world built around carefully managed public images and even more carefully managed private ones, names don't disappear by accident. They disappear because someone decided they should. Most people who have heard the name at all assume they already know what it means. A minor figure, a background detail, someone who passed briefly through a larger story and left no real mark. That is the version that survived. And for nearly 3 decades, nobody pushed hard enough to find out whether it was true. What did you think you knew about Nancy Guthrie before today? Drop it in the comments. We want to see how deep the misconception actually runs. The documented record is thin, deliberately or not. There are 2 confirmed references. One from 1987, one from a profile piece published 4 years later that repeated the same surface-level detail without adding anything new. Both mentions describe her in relation to someone else. Neither one treats her as a subject in her own right. That pattern, always adjacent, never central, is exactly what makes her story so difficult to reconstruct, and so easy to misread. She was not invisible. She was just never quite in focus. The world she moved through in the mid to late 1980s was one where access was everything and documentation was selective. What made it into print reflected choices, editorial, personal, sometimes legal. What didn't make it into print reflected choices too. And the gap between those 2 categories is where Nancy Guthrie's actual story lives. By the early 1990s, her name had effectively stopped appearing anywhere. No dispute, no dramatic exit, just a gradual fade that, in retrospect, looks less like coincidence and more like consensus. The people who knew where she fit into the larger picture either stopped talking about it or were never asked the right questions to begin with. Most viewers who encounter her name today piece together the same rough outline, the same 2 references, the same secondhand description, the same assumption about what her role was and why it ended. It feels complete enough that most people stop there. But the one detail that would make everything else make sense, the detail hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades, wasn't in any of those records. It was somewhere else entirely. She was not someone who arrived from nowhere. That is the first thing worth understanding about Nancy Guthrie, because the version of her that history preserved treats her almost as if she did. The world she came from had its own weight, its own structure, its own set of rules about who mattered and who didn't. It was the kind of environment that produced capable, sharp people in large numbers and then promptly forgot most of them the moment something shinier came along. She understood that dynamic early, and for a while she worked within it well. By the mid-1980s, she had built something real, not famous, not the kind of visible that gets documented and archived and referenced in profiles 20 years later, but present, genuinely, meaningfully present in the circles that were shaping the larger story she would eventually become attached to. The people around her at that time remember a person with a clear sense of direction. Someone who didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. That version of Nancy Guthrie, the one that existed before the silence, is almost entirely absent from the public record. What little survived was filtered through someone else's account of her. There was one person in particular whose path kept crossing hers during this period. A figure who was, at the time, moving toward a much more public kind of prominence, the sort that attracts documentation, generates archives, and eventually produces the kind of legacy that other people write chapters about. Their connection was neither accidental nor trivial. It was grounded in shared professional context, in proximity, in the particular way that 2 people can become quietly important to each other without anyone outside the relationship fully registering what is happening. What makes that connection significant is not its intensity. It is its timing. Because 1986 was not a neutral year for either of them. It was the year when the larger story, the one most people know, the one that generated the interviews and the profiles and the carefully managed public narrative, began taking the shape it would hold for the next 3 decades. And Nancy Guthrie was closer to the center of that formation than any subsequent account has been willing to acknowledge. She wasn't a witness to what was being built. She was part of the building. The contrast between that reality and the footnote she eventually became is not subtle once you see it. It is the kind of gap that doesn't appear by accident. It appears when someone or several someones decide that a cleaner story is more useful than an accurate one. And when those two worlds finally crossed paths, neither of them would ever fully return to what they were before. The silence did not happen all at once. That is the first thing the timeline makes clear when you lay it out in full. It happened in stages, each one small enough to look like nothing, each one building on the last until the cumulative effect was total. Between 1987 and 1992, Nancy Guthrie's name appears in the documented record exactly twice. After 1992, it disappears entirely. No falling out reported. No public explanation offered. Just a clean, sudden stop that nobody in the mainstream coverage of that period thought to question. That absence should have been a story on its own. It wasn't. The mechanism behind it, when you trace it carefully, is not the dramatic kind. There was no single press conference where her name was officially retired. No legal document with her name crossed out. What there was, and what the archived material from this period shows clearly, is something more mundane and more effective than either of those things. There was a gradual realignment of how the larger story was told. Certain details got emphasized, others got quietly dropped, and the version that emerged from that process had no meaningful place for Nancy Guthrie in it. This is how most erasures actually work. Not with force, with repetition. By the mid-1990s, the public narrative had solidified into a shape that has remained largely unchanged ever since. The profiles from that era tell a consistent story. The same landmarks, the same turning points, the same cast of significant figures. Nancy Guthrie is not among them. And because the narrative felt complete, because it had internal logic and emotional coherence, almost no one looked for what was missing from it. What the record does show, if you cross-reference the 1987 reference against the documented timeline of events from that same year, is a contradiction. A small one. The kind that is easy to miss if you are only reading one source. But when you place the two accounts side by side, the dates don't align. The sequence of events described publicly does not match the sequence that the archived material suggests actually occurred. Someone's version of events had been adjusted, and the adjustment, notably, moved Nancy Guthrie further from the center of the story and closer to its edges. That is not an accident. Accidents don't adjust in one consistent direction. What happened in 1998 and who tried to surface the truth is exactly the kind of story that doesn't make it into mainstream coverage. If you want to follow this kind of deep research, subscribe. We go where the headlines don't. The person who was saying one thing publicly while the record showed another was not a minor figure. They were central, the kind of central that makes contradictions dangerous to surface and inconvenient to pursue. Which is precisely why the contradiction survived for as long as it did. Nobody with the platform to make it matter had a strong enough reason to push. But what makes this silence remarkable isn't that it worked. It's that one person, someone no one was paying attention to, nearly broke it open in 1998, and almost no one knows what they found. In 1998, someone got close. Closer than anyone before them, and closer than anyone who came after for the next 2 decades. The details of who this person was matter less than what they had in their possession, because what they had was specific. Not rumor, not second-hand account. Documented material that placed Nancy Guthrie's role in the larger story in a fundamentally different position than the public narrative had ever acknowledged. They had dates. They had correspondence. They had at least one source willing to speak on record, which in this particular world, at that particular moment, was extraordinarily rare. They were not a household name. That is important, because the assumption when people imagine a near-miss like this one is that it must have involved someone powerful enough to be suppressed dramatically. A major publication pulling a story, a legal team making a threatening phone call, a network killing a segment at the last moment. None of that appears to have happened here. What happened was quieter, and in some ways harder to explain. The person stopped. Not because they were forced to, because the cost of continuing began to outweigh, in their own private calculation, what the truth was actually worth to them at that point in their life. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it is an honest one. If you've ever had your version of events quietly sidelined, your name left out, your contribution uncredited, your story told by someone else, then you already understand exactly what Nancy Guthrie was navigating. The specific texture of watching something true about you get absorbed into a version of events that has no room for you in it. The particular exhaustion of knowing that correcting the record would cost more than most people would think was reasonable to pay. By 1998, Nancy Guthrie had been outside the public narrative for 6 years. What the documented material from this period suggests, carefully without overstating, is that the erasure had real consequences for her. Professional ones. The kind that compound quietly over time and are almost impossible to trace back to a single cause, which makes them nearly impossible to address or appeal. She had not disappeared from her own life, but she had been made to disappear from the account of events that her own life had directly shaped. That is the cost that rarely gets calculated when these stories get told. Not the dramatic fall, the slow, undocumented narrowing of what becomes possible. The person who almost told the truth in 1998 made a choice. Whether it was the wrong one depends entirely on what you think the truth is actually owed, and to whom. What is not in dispute is that they made it, and that making it had consequences of its own. What that person chose to do instead, and the quiet arrangement that followed, wouldn't fully surface until a researcher stumbled across a single box of documents more than 20 years later. The box contained 43 pages. Some typed, some handwritten, some dated, some not. And taken together, they told a story that was not complicated, it was just true, which, after nearly 3 decades of a carefully maintained alternative, felt almost disorienting to read. What the documents established, plainly and without requiring interpretation, was that Nancy Guthrie's proximity to the larger narrative had not been peripheral. It had been foundational. The role she occupied in the period between 1986 and 1991, the years the public record treats as belonging entirely to someone else, was not the role of a background figure who happened to be present. It was the role of someone whose contribution shaped what came next in ways that the official version of events had never once acknowledged. That is not a small thing. It is the kind of thing that, once you see it clearly, makes every prior account look not just incomplete but actively misleading. The specific nature of her contribution is traceable. There are dated documents that place her at the center of decisions that public accounts attribute entirely to others. There is correspondence, the kind that people write when they believe they are not being watched for posterity, that describes her in terms no public profile ever used. Capable.
Indispensable.
The person in the room who understood what was actually happening while everyone else was focused on how it looked. She was not a collaborator in the minor sense. She was architecture. And the people who built their public legacy on the foundation she helped construct never said so. Not once. Not in interviews. Not in the memoirs that came later. Not in the retrospective profiles that asked, with apparent sincerity, how they had achieved what they achieved. The name Nancy Guthrie does not appear in any of those accounts. The contribution those 43 pages document does not appear in any of those accounts. What appears instead is a version of events so clean, so self-contained, so carefully attributed, that it could only have been constructed because lives, real ones, do not actually look that tidy from the inside. This is the part that sits hardest. Not the erasure itself, as damaging as it was. Not the near miss in 1998, or the quiet arrangement that followed it. The part that sits hardest is that the beneficiaries of that silence were not passive. The documented material makes clear that the shaping of the narrative was not something that simply happened around them. They were present for it. In some cases, they directed it. The cleaner story was not an accident that nobody corrected. It was a preference that somebody maintained. For Nancy Guthrie, the practical consequences of that maintenance stretched across years. Opportunities that the documented record suggests she was positioned to pursue did not materialize. Connections that should have carried her name forward carried other names instead. The professional narrowing that Chapter 4 described did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the specific context of a record that had been quietly reorganized to exclude her. None of that has ever been publicly acknowledged by anyone in a position to acknowledge it. What nobody has publicly addressed, not then, not now, is the simplest question of all. Did anyone who benefited from that silence ever actually reckon with what it cost her? There is a certain kind of ending that wraps everything up cleanly. The truth comes out, the record gets corrected, and the person who was wronged gets the acknowledgement they deserved all along. Nancy Guthrie's story does not end that way. Most real stories don't. What it ends with is something quieter and, in some ways, more lasting. A fuller picture. A name that now carries more than a two-line reference in someone else's archive. A life that, when you look at it honestly and completely, was never actually small. It was just described that way by people who had reasons to keep it small. She made real choices in a real world with real stakes. That is worth saying plainly. The question this story leaves behind is not really about Nancy Guthrie specifically. It is about the mechanism, the ordinary, unremarkable process by which certain names get carried forward and others get quietly set aside. No single villain. No dramatic conspiracy. Just a long series of small decisions, each one defensible on its own, that accumulate into something that looks a lot like erasure when you finally step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. Historians and archivists have a term for this. They call it the silences in the record. The gaps that tell you as much as the documents do, if you know to look for them. Nancy Guthrie's silence lasted nearly 3 decades. That is not unusual. What is unusual is that anyone went looking at all. Most people consume history the way it is handed to them. That is not a criticism, it is simply true. There are too many stories, too many names, too many versions of events for any one person to verify all of it. So a shorthand develops. Certain names become landmarks. Others become footnotes. And the footnotes, over time, stop getting read. What changes when someone does go looking? When someone pulls the archived interview, cross-references the dates, notices the contradiction in the official timeline, is not just the story itself. It is the habit of mind that makes the looking possible. The willingness to treat a gap as information rather than absence. Nancy Guthrie deserved a real account. This has been an attempt at one. Not complete, no account of a life ever is. But honest about what the record shows, what it hides, and what that gap means. Her name is no longer just a footnote. It is a question worth asking. Nancy Guthrie's story is one of dozens that got quietly folded into someone else's history. The next name we're pulling out of the archive, and the cover story that surrounded it for over 40 years, is coming very soon. You won't want to come in midway.